Everyone, if you could please shuffle back to some seat for the last panel of the day. I know it has been a bit of a long day, but we have saved some of the most important and best for last. This is where we talk about the money in part anyway. And also you will have plenty of opportunities to keep chatting over a drink after this session. So yes, if we could all take our seats, that would be great. So this is the final panel of the day, and no day would be complete without talking both about partnerships and finance, especially against the current sort of background context of things like local authority funding cuts and just general uncertainty about where some of our money and resources are coming from when we're talking about sustainability. But today we've already heard quite a lot of examples of ways in which people have managed to create space in budgets by basically taking the starting line of doing nothing is not an option, and also come up with, through ingenuity, new models of how to access funding or support, whether that's through new partnerships with universities, through basically prodding their local authority and finding their champions within local authorities to support them. And in the broader sense, some of the stuff that maybe hasn't come up quite as clearly today, but we also know that a lot of organizations have started experimenting with things like crowdfunding and how that can contribute to an overall budget. So this panel really is talking about how we can build some more of those solid partnerships and alliances, and get back to particularly Simon's provocation from the very first panel this morning, which was around building alliances beyond just the arts and cultural sector and reaching out to people like scientists and universities, to policymakers, to cities, to sort of build the sector that we'd like to see. So joining me here today, to my left is Stephanie, Chief Executive of Nottingham Playhouse, who you may have heard speak earlier today about their capital project. You already heard quite a lot of her bio earlier. It is very long. She has done most things in theatre it is possible to do. But also, I think particularly crucial to this panel is, Nottingham Playhouse did work very closely with Nottingham Trent University on their capital project to help them get impartial advice. And they did also work very closely with their local authority and managed to get match funding for their capital project through basically having a rent waiver for 12 years. And the other thing that is important to know about Stephanie is that she has fundraised for and overseen 4 capital projects during her career. Also joining me is Sean Durney. He's an Arts and Participation Officer at Culture Liverpool, Liverpool City Council. So a lot of his time is taken up with ensuring Liverpool City Council funded organisations meet the obligations of their funding agreements, but he has also been very busy working with them to explore new and additional and different sources of funding and income. And the reason he's here today is because a few weeks ago when we sent out our Julie's Bicycle Sustaining Creativity survey, he emailed back and went, I've written an MA on how cultural organisations in Liverpool are addressing climate change. So he is one of those great champions in a council who is trying to bring together culture and sustainability and find ways in which we can most effectively address the needs of both. And lastly is Gary Topp, who's Director of Culture Centre at Culture Central, the new city-scale cultural development agency for Birmingham. He has a huge, illustrious career behind him as well. Among other things, he has been development director for Bristol Green Capital. He's also led organisations including Yorkshire Culture, Greening Australia, and the Curzon Community Cinema. So a lot of his work specialises in bringing together partners from the public, private and third sector and forming those new collaborations. So I will give over to each of them in turn to talk a bit about your perspective on what kinds of partnerships and what kinds of alliances we need, where we might go to think about new sources of funding and investment to support environmental sustainability in the arts and creative industries.
Thank you very much. I'll repeat myself slightly because not everyone was here earlier, but the thing about sustainability and environmental upgrading of your premises is that although it may be your responsibility to do, it's everyone's responsibility to improve the carbon footprint. It's everyone's responsibility to protect the planet. So I think it's a little bit different from fundraising for some things. Although what we're fundraising for here is not always that interesting to the public, in terms of statutory bodies, local authorities and so on, it's got to be done. We've got to improve the carbon footprint of our cities, not just your venue. So I think it's a good starting point, which is this is a shared problem, it's a shared issue, and how do we jointly approach the solution to that issue, some of which is going to involve money. I think the thing about money also is it's a down payment on a guaranteed return, because if you're going to stick to the things which are going to get you the bang for the buck in terms of environmental impact, really it's as much about cash flow as it is about grants. And I think it's a very positive way to look at it, which is that if you can put up this match funding, we're going to unleash this amount of investment, match investment in our city, in our environmental impact, and that's a shared responsibility. So you've got the bang for the buck of the environmental upgrade, then you've got the bang for the buck of the match funding, hopefully unlocking money from somewhere like the Arts Council or from Europe at the moment, but not for much longer. And it's that way to look at it. It's about value, it's about adding value, it's about matching. Because doing nothing isn't an option, it's not a case of if, it's a case of how. And so the how question in terms of the people that you work with, I think when you go to those people and you say, we have a problem, we have an issue we need to address, and we need to find a solution, not in an aggressive way, but in, this can't go on like this, so how do we come to the solution? We're really fortunate in Nottingham because we have Nottingham Trent, and Professor Amin El-Hababy in particular, but his whole team got behind this from the outset. And what that gave us, it wasn't just all that fantastic advice and help, but it's a kind of impartiality about academia which you don't get from anywhere else. So other people are trying to sell you something, probably, even if they're only selling you their environmental services, they're still selling you something. Whereas if you have academia involved, there's a kind of impartiality that gives everything else a gloss. But to be able to go to, for example, a city council and say, look, we've had these studies done, these are the pictures, this is the impact, this is the solution, we could do this. They could have said no, they could have said we'll help you in part. In the end, they gave us a complete rent waiver for 13 years. But we viewed it as a joint problem and we found a joint solution. The other thing is dividing bits off. If you find there's something, having a carpet is actually more environmentally friendly in many ways because it keeps the thing warmer. It doesn't really matter. If you've got your shopping list of stuff that you need for your venue, for your upgrade, and one of it's carpet and one of it's new seating or whatever it is, or dimmable lights, whatever it is, you might need to go through some quite bitty process of dividing out that, and finding the partner for each project. For us, the local heritage organisation, the Civic Society, were particularly concerned that when the glazing was done, it was done in a certain way. Now, they couldn't raise us any money, but what they did do in the end was they said, we're completely happy with your approach. So they saved us a lot of time in the end. We were getting to an impasse. And because they came on board, because they wanted something good to happen and they wanted to help save the not save the playhouse, but preserve the playhouse, their influence was worth more than money. So there's also that. There's also there's the value of things that are non-financial that can be used to unlock things that are financial. But shaking buckets is not so good.
Okay. So I work for a local authority. That's not an excuse for you to start throwing eggs. But I will give you a little bit of sort of context and maybe a reality check on what the situation is for local authorities. What is absolutely clear, though, throughout this is that I think you'll find that most local authorities, most councils, most councillors have an interest in this area of work and want to see positive benefits. I think in the case of Liverpool, we've got just so many positives, but there's a couple of negatives that are holding us back at the moment. And one of those is around the amount of funding that we get from central government. We've got a very proactive mayor who's overseeing another £90 million worth of cuts over the next 3 years, on top of £420 million worth of cuts that he's had to do since 2010. He doesn't want to do them. It's not, you know, he tells us it's not fair the way things are set out. Liverpool, despite the great successes that we've had since European Capital of Culture, which changed people's perceptions of the city, is still, you know, high on the indices of deprivation in certain areas. Aren't wealthy, aren't prosperous. We don't have a massive manufacturing base to collect business rates from. We don't have lots of big houses to collect lots of council tax from, and that's the difference. The central government is changing the formula for how business rates and council rates and the central government grant is allocated, and that is not in Liverpool's favour. It's, you know, it favours other councils in certain parts of the country, but it doesn't favour Liverpool. So that's the sort of backdrop to where we stand at the moment. You know, the mayor's really committed to culture. He says it's the rocket fuel of regeneration. We're actually getting more visitors now into the city than we got during 2008. There's still hotels being built. There's still lots of development going on. There's still loads of potential in the city as well for visitors, and it is if you haven't been, please come and visit. It is a fantastic city. I've spoken to a few people today and who've been to Liverpool. I even found an Evertonian, which was nice. And they all said how much they enjoyed coming to the city, and it is a fantastic place to visit. We do have a sustainable energy plan as well, led by a select committee. We're just about to publish some good news on that as well, in that we've reached a target that we set in for 2020 to reduce carbon impact by 20%. That's going to get reached this year, and I'm reliably informed that they're going to increase the threshold of that to 2020 and beyond. And that's through, you know, fairly simple projects that the council's been able to invest in. It's through things like LED street lighting, through bike schemes, through building standards changing, and, you know, new housing being built. So there's lots of good news there. The pressure comes from obviously from the funding cuts that we have to implement. Part of my job is to give grants to cultural organisations. So I work with 36 organisations at the moment. We're giving them grants this year, totaling around 2.7 million. It sounds like a lot. It's not. When in 2010 we were giving out 4.2 million, and things were on a much more sustainable basis back then, and that grant amount is going to reduce as well, or could reduce as well, unless we can find alternative sources of funding. So again, part of my work is to work with the cultural organisations to see how they can be sustainable in the broader sense financially, and for them to keep going, and some of them are in survival mode. So part of what I'm working with other officers in the council is around things like invest to save, invest to earn. I've also done an MA in looking at the energy efficiency of the sector. So basically, I've got quite a bit of information about how the organisations behave, the kind of things that they're able to do and not able to do. And a lot of it comes down to the organisation's own circumstances, whether they actually own their buildings, whether they've got a long lease on the buildings. If they rent, they're actually very unlikely to be taking any technical measures or to be able to do any kind of technical measures. So the more you look into it, the more actually complex it becomes to deal with the sector. Individual examples, I've got plenty of those as well, where we're working with organisations like FACT, Unity, Bluecoat, and when they come to us with a capital project, we're able to say to them, well, if you can reduce your revenue requirement to the council, we will be able to fund your project. So it's similar to your situation. We've got a number of examples of that. But you know, that's not the whole picture of it as well, and there is complexity in how to understand the sort of technological elements and also the behavioural elements. And I'm quite happy to go into that maybe a bit later and not spend the next half an hour taking everybody's time.
Thanks very much. It's always interesting at the end of a very long day around this, isn't it, to think about something fresh to say. But it seems to me what was said at the very beginning by Simon and Stephen, if I got their names right, was just, it made me smile. I loved the way they started with it. And Chiara, you did this beautifully as well, which is to say, you can always spend these days having technical conversations about LED lights, but somehow or other that may not actually be what motivates some of us to be involved in the arts. And there can be a kind of gap between those two spaces that certainly in my career I found really interesting. And I think I say this as somebody that's still quite unusual in the cultural sector, in that quite deliberately I took a moment out of my career in another country, in another sector, and that sector was really around sustainability and future cities, in another part of the world called Australia. And I did it for some reasons of keeping myself fresh and interested. That's always a nice thing to do, isn't it? But also because the cultural development work that I'd really done over 15 years in the north of England felt so apparently related to community and economy and cities and change, that if you start to think about those two things, and it's a dialogue in the cultural sector we've been having for a long time now, we used to call it culturally led regeneration, you start to think about, well, what is the future places, the future cities we want our sector to be involved in, and have we got the dialogue between creativity and culture and cities and future and sustainability right in our heads yet? Yeah? And I do think you laid that out lovely at the beginning in terms of this is not just a transactional thing about LED lights. This is actually fundamentally the issue of our time. Yeah. So then if I springboard off of that, and I'll tell you a little bit about Culture Central in a minute, into the comments that you've just made very clearly about some of the challenges that you're facing from a local government perspective in your particular city, Liverpool, and of course I could make exactly the same comments for this city. The difference is I don't work for local government anymore. I have, and I work closely with them, and I'm a huge fan of local government. But what comes out of that for me is a need for a much more fundamental system change right now. And it's interesting, isn't it? We've got the fundamental system change required in the cultural sector, yeah? Because actually the old cultural policy regimes and funding are kind of grinding to a bit of a halt right now, and they need reinventing. But actually we've also got this macro situation that we're all trying to deal with. The COP and the major environmental issues also tell us is of our time, isn't it? And then we've got the fact that I think we live in the age of cities. So we'll know this lovely figure, half of us live in cities at the moment, 2/3 will by the time we're all knocking on a bit. So we've got this moment where we've got to reinvent culture, creativity, sustainability. That's a big conversation, isn't it? And suddenly for me feels like something that's very of our time. Yeah? It is what it is to be a human being at the moment, and if you're interested in art and culture, it seems to me it has something to say about what art and culture and institutions that deliver that kind of stuff have in the mix. So I hope I'm slightly confusing you, yeah? Slightly bringing together some conflated, very big philosophical, ethical issues, and also saying, well, how are we going to make a set of responses from this particular sector that we all love and care about that seem appropriate to that? And I think that's a really interesting space to get into, and I think it fundamentally requires system change. Yeah? And we're a bit shy about that sometimes. But if you think about the fact that we have traditionally looked for our cultural policy lead to perhaps come from government through the agencies like the Arts Council and through local government, I would make an argument, and it's the foundation of Culture Central actually, that it's time that the sector defined its own leadership, set its own course in a different kind of way, and that Culture Central is a very simple thing. It's all of the institutions in the city coming together to say that we need to be the architects of our own future in our own city now. Yep. So it's established as a company, we'll roll it out as membership, think of it a little bit like a chamber of commerce for the sector, think about all the areas that it wants to influence, whether that's the way that the sector defines its own business models, the way it works with its own communities, the way that it thinks about its own programming, the way that it is more self-defining. Yep. And you need, in my view, a structure against which to do that, and Culture Central is that. So it's not a loose forum, it is a company. Yep. It is set up as a collaboration for innovation, not as a collaboration for hand-holding. Yep. And if you think about that, it seems to me quite right and proper that you start to address some of the issues that we've been thinking about today. But there's something else that's really important about sector leadership or taking yourself on your own journey, because I think that's very much at the heart of what cities and places are learning to do as well at the moment. So should we be waiting for the agents of government, yeah, wherever that lies right now, yeah, from Europe to local to parish, whatever, to put in place a set of rules and regulations that make the change happen that we want to have happen? Whether that's around education or social services or culture or whatever, these are all things. Or do we actually look at some of the examples that are starting to come through in places around the world where people, and I'm not talking about militant action here, I'm talking about self-determination of place, about why actually growing vegetables on your street corner is actually a powerful and important antidote to monocultures and the major supermarkets. And that somehow or other, the discourse of the cultural sector, I think, has a right and proper place in that I'm sometimes not sure we've quite found yet. Yeah. And the reason I think that, and I've talked about this before, is because actually all of that time I spent managing teams and delivering the work of retrofit and all the rest of it, yeah, I actually also worried all the time that actually poetry might be more effective. Yeah? And that if you can inspire the hearts and minds of people, and surely that's the business of culture and creativity, we might actually allow the practical steps to fall in behind in a different way, as opposed to address it always from the practical side. And that sometimes we undersell the very thing that in the cultural sector we love, which is just the power of art to be transformational, yeah, at this moment, to be exactly that, to liberate it to be transformational in some way. And then if we think about the cultural institutions and the creative communities and the artists, we have to somehow allow them to be the architects of the change that we want to see in a way that I think we're a little bit shy of still, and that will bring the innovation that we want behind it, rather than always address this from the practical end and talk too much about retrofitting buildings. So I'm not arguing against all of that. I'm arguing very passionately for it, but that's been done all day long. Yeah? I'm just trying to bring a little bit of another voice to it, which says actually maybe there's a part of this dialogue as we reinvent our cities and we reinvent the way that culture and creativity is part of it, that we actually just need to let art do its thing a bit better, yeah, and be a voice for transformation in a way that we haven't quite liberated yet, that civic responsibility role, that community role. It's just some additional thoughts to throw in and allow a little bit, for me, of the art and the poetry to come out at the end of the day, as well as the technology and the retrofitting, and see how we pinch them together to create innovation and revolution at the scale that we all know is required.
So we've gone from the micro all the way out. I'm going to try bring some of it back in again. I suppose one of the themes that has come through quite strongly throughout the day, from the morning and through this panel as well, is the strength and importance of networks to help us unlock additional funding and exchange knowledge. Again, from the Manchester Art Sustainability team in the morning, all the way to I suppose some of the examples here, I was kind of wondering whether you had anything similar in Nottingham when you were doing your capital work, you know, whether there was somewhere to tap into. And I know Sean's working on a project in Liverpool at the moment with Bluecoat to bring together a network of cultural organisations to apply to an ERDF fund and unlock some funding in that way. And whether there were any better mechanisms that you could think of that we could enable that kind of the creation of those networks a bit more to make it easier for some of that resource and knowledge sharing and to be unlocked and to happen. And yeah.
Nottingham has a strategic cultural partnership, which is fairly fledgling, but we have a history of working together in the cultural sector. So, for example, we have Ticketing Network East Midlands, which is a consortium that was formed to jointly apply for funding for Tessitura box office software. So there's a lot of sharing of resources that goes on. I think what we found is we like to do things at the pace that we need to do them at. So I think it's a responsibility of ours, and it's also about sustainability, that if any knowledge we get, any information we get, we share. So we're always very happy to do that. Anyone wants to phone us up or come and see us, they'll get the information that we've got. We're not experts by any stretch of the imagination, but that's also part of the responsibility, if you like. People operate in different, very different circumstances. We were particularly challenged in this area. Firstly, through massive funding cuts, 100% funding cut from Nottinghamshire County Council, and steady cuts from Nottingham City Council, which is in a very similar position to Liverpool City Council in terms of the indices of deprivation of many of its residents and the terrible settlement it got from central government, although not as bad as yours, but shockingly bad. So that's the environment we're working in. I think in terms of partnership working, universities are fantastic, other cultural venues are fantastic. We share the information we have. Someone tracks down a quick win or something smart, whether we're sharing that at a city level or we're part of the Big 13 producing theatres nationally, of which Liverpool Everyman and Playhouse, who are here, are also one. We share information that way. The first time I experienced a presentation from Julie's Bicycle was at one of those meetings. I think it's this flow of information because I don't see them as separate things. I don't think it is the technical and the creative. We can't do the creative without the technical sorted. And the idea of wasting even a penny or even wasting a great idea about how to make the money go further is just sacrilegious to me. So it's that flow. I mean, the brilliant thing about technology is that you don't need formal groupings anymore. You can have a great idea. You can get something from Twitter. The other thing is recycle everyone's ideas, nick their great ideas. For God's sake, people have great ideas, steal them. It's not like art. You shouldn't go around stealing people's artistic ideas. That's called plagiarism, and that's a bad thing. But with people's technology ideas and the things that they do to save money and earn money, then nick them, of course, recycle. So I think it's a good time in that sense. The flow of information, the flow of great ideas, picking up things today. I've just, seen some things here today that we can do. You're never going to stop picking up those things. And then I just think our responsibility is to pass it on,
Well, I think Liverpool's actually quite far advanced in terms of its networks. We've got a couple of things that I think you'd be quite interested in. There's a network called LARC, which is Liverpool Arts Regeneration Consortium, and that's the bigger organisations who come together as a group, and so that's the likes of the Bluecoat, the Everyman Playhouse, the Liverpool Biennial, the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, Tate Liverpool, but they came together as a sort of reaction to the European Capital of Culture, but that also precipitated another effect in that the small medium organisations got together as well. So now there's a grouping of about 36 to 40 of them called COOL, which is the Creative Organisations of Liverpool. I work quite a lot with COOL, and part of my work with them is to actually empower them rather than us supplying all the solutions and we try and help them set an agenda, but we don't force them down a particular line. So a few years ago we ran a business development program. It was called Fit for the Future. We had it before you, actually. But that was around business development, and we did some workshops with them. But in the end, we said to COOL, it's probably better that you do this because you know where your needs are, and it feels a bit like the local authorities being overly paternalistic and trying to control what they do. And we're not trying to do that. We're actually trying to empower them. So the empowerment of Cool is something that we're really, really supportive of. But there's other sort of organisations out there as well. I keep a mailing list of over 300 small creative organisations, and people who are on the sort of grey area of whether they're an arts organisation or a community organisation who does arts activities. And I supply a lot of information to them on a regular basis about what funding is available, whether there's resources that can be shared, whether there's partnerships that can be set up. So that kind of work is happening on an ongoing basis. I'm also working with people like Liverpool Community Renewables who want to work with cultural organisations to set up local energy networks and things like that. So I just keep pushing at it all the time, and to try and make sure that awareness is actually raised, which is part of what when I did my research, what they asked for is they wanted more information, they wanted training. They also want grants as well. They want grants to be able to do these things, and I think that's fair enough. And part of the work as well is to support them in being able to access those grants. And some of those grants are really tricky to get. Notwithstanding everything that was said before, there is a lot of technical language, there is a lot of requirements from the funders that isn't instantly obvious to do for organisations who are used to putting bids to Arts Council for creative projects. So I think there is a bit of a skills and a gap in knowledge that needs to be addressed to really fulfil the potential of all that other resources that are out there. I think the cultural organisation naturally good with working with communities, then naturally good at communicating messages, and would be the ideal agents of change, as has been said before. But I think there probably does need to be stronger sort of policy lead and information given to them so that they can communicate those messages, because I did another little bit of research. I didn't research the whole country, I found it in The Guardian, but 36% of the population of England doesn't actually believe that man is influencing climate change. Half of Americans don't. So there's still a task to be undertaken. The biggest concern for people in this country, we were bottom of a list of 17 countries, is about population and migration, and climate change is very low on those lists of concerns. So there's still a massive job to be done with the population as well as some of the politicians who are, and the system that we've got as well, which I think, is it called carbon lock-in? The economy's got a carbon lock-in, as it's very difficult to break out of it and to get into a new situation where you're carbon neutral, because everything is set up for you to buy gas and electricity and to use your car, and those changes have to come both from the people, but they also have to come from the policy makers. I'll leave you with that one to solve.
This is a fascinating conversation to try and push through, isn't it? Yeah. So, if I can just go back to one of the other pieces of work that I did when Bristol was European Green Capital. Bristol has the world's biggest Green Capital Partnership. So over 800 organisations come together. And really my job of work over a period of 18 months there, as Bristol was European Green Capital, was to think about how that amazing group of so many organisations could actually be a powerful force for city change. So it goes to the heart of this. Where does that change come from? Does it come from the policymakers who by and large come out of the public sector, yeah, and a traditional set of thinking, codified behaviour that's in that, or does it come out of 800 in that case plus organisations thinking differently, thinking laterally, thinking in an innovative way? There's not an absolute answer to that, but I became convinced that you need both of those systems. Yeah? You need that process of what you might think of bottom-up energy as much as you do top-down energy, but that by and large, all of the resources, notwithstanding cuts and things, all of the resources still lies in one place, not in the other. Yeah? And so you have to, in a piece of physics, don't you? You have to put wit, intelligence, creativity, collaboration and energy into the bit that's not traditionally resource or traditionally about policy making, and see how you can push up into the space that is still about government and top-down and industry and oil companies and all of those things, and create an equal and opposite force. Yeah? So please remember, I'm agreeing with everything that's been said all day today about retrofitting, and I'm agreeing with all that. I'm just trying to take us into a different kind of set of thinking as well. And then you say, gosh, hasn't that always been the business of art? Yeah? To ask those questions in creative, engaging, challenging ways. And if this is the issue of our day and we've got these fantastic cultural institutions, isn't there a kind of lovely ethical and moral responsibility here that we need to respond to in some way, to do this business of saying, how are we going to build the cities of the future? Cities that every city policy in the world will say values culture and creativity. You find me a city strategy, yeah, that doesn't identify creative and culture as one of its major industrial sectors, yeah? I've always, the Liverpool Mayor's rocket fuel thing, but you can echo that right around the world. Every city's got a version of that right now. So actually the responsibility that I enjoy is, okay, how are we going to organise ourselves as a sector to meet that amazing challenge? Yeah, and we definitely meet it by putting beehives on our roofs. I mean, I actually think that's a very radical gesture, yeah? But actually if you collectivise that, and then you start to flow that through into our fundamental business models, our fundamental behaviours, then actually you start to do something that is about something potentially more powerful. Because we have to remember that there's been climate change talks since 1992, I think, and what's happened to carbon every year? They just keep going up. Yeah? So somehow or other there is something that's not quite working, and I guess the purpose of the great work that Julie's Bicycles and the team do is to say, actually, we think the cultural and creative sector has a locus in that it needs to exercise beyond the transaction of simply retrofitting buildings, is my argument. It's, of course, got to do that, but actually, maybe it's got more that it could do too, and we need to come together and find our voice on that in a way that, for me, is actually quite humble. It's quite reflective. This is not about banners on the street. It's about saying there is a quiet power to culture and creativity that it would be nice to do a little bit more around with this major issue of our day. And I'm always going to promulgate that we should do that standing together, thinking laterally and innovatively, rather than just transactionally.
I mean, I agree. I think there's a couple of points. One is that cultural organisations can't use the grant that they get from us for political purposes, so there's a little bit of a fine line to choose. But I would also say that the council, our council, and I'm sure everybody else's councils, you're knocking on an open door, really, because they can see, most politicians want what's best for their communities and for the future of their cities, and, we do build those into any decision our cabinet makes. There is we have to write an assessment of how that might affect the climate change framework. So anything that's positive towards that, I think you'll find that it is an open door. It is just how to open that door and really unlock the potential.
This is a really, really quick one. It's not really about the environment, but I think increasingly cultural organisations are taking responsibilities that cultural organisations didn't used to take in yesteryear. And certainly we're aware of the situation being faced in our city. I think something like 70% of kids growing up in a household where they're both parents, if they're both there, have no formal education or qualifications at all. And one of the things that the cultural organisation in our city and many cities are doing is they're providing a kind of, not quite, but almost cultural social services. So we're actually doing stuff for nothing. Sometimes that isn't actually funded directly by anybody, because actually what we have with cultural organisations is we have this huge amount of talent and great ideas, and creative organisations are great at great ideas, and they're also great at responding swiftly to changes in society. And I've noticed that change in the last 5 years. We are now embracing things which a few years ago we would have said, well, that's fine, but we'll apply for a grant to do that. And now we're saying, do you know what, we've got a couple of mornings free, we'll deliver that, we'll provide pay what you can tickets, because we've got to, because we have a kind of moral responsibility. And it's all really part of the same argument, I think.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for anyone on the panel?
I'm Claire from Julie's Bicycle. Sorry, I'm going to be a bit cheeky and just to respond particularly to what you were saying, Gary, I think from our perspective, we've been working for 10 years. We started the music sector in a very nuts and bolts approach and a very practical approach. And over the last 10 years, we have seen a lot of change. And I think especially with the leadership of the Arts Council since 2012, for every year for the last 4 years, we've done a report on what's going on within the sector. The first 3 years, we really focused on the nuts and bolts, and then we started looking at the more interesting sustainable buildings projects. Last year's annual report, for the first time, we had this huge task of trying to communicate all of this other stuff and the recognition of the power of the sector and the transformational value that it has and the role it has to play in sustainability. We tried to put together a synopsis of all of the amazing pieces of art and heritage and culture museums on what's being done to address it. So I think from our perspective, we really see that change, and the challenge is bringing that together. But we do see examples where the sector and leading organisations are saying, okay, we're going to do this, and we are setting the agenda. And I think Manchester is a fantastic example of their work, and the Manchester Climate Change Agency has identified the arts and culture as a key means of engaging people, and they have done some really, really interesting things. So I would argue that we are seeing that starting to happen now, and probably one of the key challenges is how do we focus it and bring it together.
Any more questions? Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Stephen Frame from Bureau 4. We're consultant project managers. I've been lucky enough to work on about, I think, half a dozen cultural projects throughout my career, including FACT in Liverpool, however many years ago that was now, but as well as a lot of big commercial schemes as well. And I think what I think is special about this sector is that, and what makes you different and so powerful, is that you have an audience. It's one of the few times as a professional, construction professional, when you actually get to talk to people who are interested in what you're doing. Because, and I think there's a real, it was something that was said earlier today about the civic function of an organisation. And I think, when you talk, people listen, and there's an opportunity for us as professionals to think about and to talk to you about how you procure things, how you tell the story about the process of building a building, how you develop a narrative around things like accessible design and sustainability, which people will actually listen to. And I think, for those of you doing capital projects, it's worth thinking about the project itself as being a process, as almost, I guess almost to some extent a piece of performance art, and not to lose the opportunities of actually telling people about what you're doing in the ground, as well as how that, as well as thinking about the output at the end. Not really a question.
Hi. Hi, my name is Sagar. It's not a question about funding, or it's more about sustainability overall. Firstly, while I said my interest was in biomaterials, it's also in circular economy and cradle to cradle, and how I've seen a lot of organisations, they talk about C2C, but they're actually only talking about their bit in the middle, which is only about 40%. Cradle to cradle should be cradle to cradle, which is birth to death and birth again. And most organisations don't calculate that. So when I look at something like LED lights, which I just Googled today some research about LED lights, and reflecting on the Green Building Council where they talk about wellness in the workplace, and the American Medical Association has said some LED lights do have an impact, negative impact on people in the workplace. Not every one of them, but it's sort of like asbestos in the 70s. So are we taking a holistic look at this without slandering any industry, which I'm not, but we have to take an introspective look at this. And the other thing is with regards to, it was spoken about earlier with regards to renewable energy. The Guardian or the Telegraph put an article, no, it was the Sky News put an article yesterday talking about sort of the cobalt, it goes into our phones. We all know that. But also cobalt goes into another product, which is solar panels and wind turbines. This isn't really spoken about much, but in my interest, which is about full accountability and circularity, are we really talking about it? And in terms of social return on investment, what is the impact on the other people in the supply chain? But I'm not digging at any industry, I'm just saying that I think we need to take a holistic look, and what do you think of that? Thank you.
I might give a quick answer in the sense that, yes, it's a huge conversation that I think to some extent isn't being had enough. But I think that probably rings true across pretty much every industry, in that wherever you look, the energy industry it's an industry, and every industry has industrial scale costs associated with it, whether that's fossil fuel extraction or whether it's the extraction of whatever ends up in wind turbines. All of that stuff is going to have to come from somewhere, and all of it will have a social and environmental cost. Where the trade-off is on that, I think that's the area that we're exploring at the moment. I mean, there was also that, it doesn't look specifically at social return, but there was a study that came out recently which sort of finally started putting the argument around what's the life cycle cost of a solar panel to bed, where at least today the energy that it will generate, that will pay back the energy that it costs to manufacture it relatively quickly. So to some extent, I think what we always have to remember is that all of this stuff is an ongoing conversation. Anything related to sustainability is. So what seems like the best option today might not be tomorrow. What is best in leading practice today, tomorrow might be hugely outdated. A really good example is the huge debate around biofuels and biodiesel and the environmental impacts that are associated with that. I suppose the danger of any of those conversations is that quite often these arguments get used as an excuse to do nothing, because there is this idea or sense that if the alternative might be worse, then we shouldn't do anything at all. Whereas the reality of it is that if we take no action, then we'll never come up with anything new. So all of this, in many ways, is a process of experimentation and actually figuring out what it is and finding our way throughout it. And we're never going to have the absolute answers associated. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
Just a quick point. I think absolutely right. You know, and we can avoid things which we know are harmful. So, for example, some renewable light bulbs contain mercury, and disposing of them is so difficult to do that you wouldn't put them anywhere where you were going to have kids, because it could easily get broken and so on and so forth. There are things like that. I think what we all need to bear in mind is some people are very much at the beginning of this journey, and it can be a reason to do nothing because it's just a minefield. And you try and approach it from a kind of Hippocratic approach of first, do no harm. But actually, because we have to do something, we have to do things which are not perfect. And then avoiding the bling factor of things. You know, if something looks like it's made of a load of plastic and a load of metal and you're not getting much out of it, then probably don't do it. You know, I think there's a certain amount of common sense. But some people are right at the start of this journey, and they use the kind of worries about this kind of thing to go, I'm just going to wait until it's perfect. But I don't think there's anything that's ever been invented that has ended up perfect, you know, so that's my worry about it. You see that go, well, just hang on another 5 years and then you'll find that there's no PV panels, you just roll them out, and by which time you've wasted X amount of energy, and it doesn't actually get to that point anyway.
I just wanted to pick, you briefly mentioned circular economy, and it seems to me that, again, if I just yo-yo between these two professions that I've been involved in, if you're in the green sector, you'll quite happily have a conversation about circular economy and all day long. It's not one we tend to have too much in the cultural sector. And there's something that I definitely haven't fully thought through yet, but is an interesting thing here, which is that the traditions of the sector around putting tax dollar into funding cultural institutions is clearly breaking down right now. Yep, I think the numbers this week indicated a 66% reduction in local authority funding for the sector this year, across everywhere. So we had a situation which said however you pay your tax, whether that's council tax or through your wages or business rates or whatever, some of that circulated back into something that we valued as a society called culture. Well, if that old version of circular economy is failing us right now, then it starts to ask some new questions about, well, what would a new circular economy for the sector look like if the tax one is falling apart? And so that goes to the heart then of actually what the business models are in the sector. So there's another form of circular economy which might mean that your regular ticket buyers are local residents quite happily paying for tickets to get something in return. And that's a little bit of a local circular economy, isn't it? But there seems to me to be a much bigger conversation now about how do we really underpin the business models of cultural institutions that, as you say, are doing everything from education to social services to providing culture in a new way. And the mechanism of thinking about that as a circular economy seems to me a useful device for rethinking what the business mechanisms of our sector need to be. And the spin-off for that, as with the circular economy debate, is it might have lots of other local supply chain, environmental, ethical benefits as well, and might go some way to addressing that community relevance issue that we talk a lot about in this sector. Are we relevant for our place and time in the way that we need to be? So in a way, it's just, I'd love to have bigger conversations about circular economy in this sector. I don't know what the answer is to it, but it seems to me a nice lens for which to look at not just the sustainability from a green sense, but the sustainability from a business sense as well.
Yeah, and Liverpool's a case in point. We're getting more visitors than ever. We're getting more cruise ships coming in than ever before. Money is coming in with tourists with all their weak pounds, and but that's not going through the local authority and being diverted into grant funding. We have looked at things like, in fact, we've lobbied national government for things like a hotel levy, whereby hotel guests would pay something towards the local cultural infrastructure. But it's very difficult to get governments to agree to more taxes when the economy is shaky. You know. I've got another point as well, which is not Liverpool City Council's view at all, but basically on that whole thing about whether the sort of benefit of new measures. There's a very interesting guy called Jeff Howells who writes for the Daily Telegraph. And if you go to Ask Jeff, he's got some very interesting views on whether a new boiler is actually any more carbon positive than the old boiler that you've had there for 36 years because of the cost of manufacture. A new boiler might only last 5 years because it's more complex as a piece of machinery. Is it worth doing? He's got views on PVC as well, as double glazing, all those kind of measures that I think are now standard in the building industry. But are they built to last? And I think that some of that comes down to the consumerist nature of the building industry and whether things are built to, and manufacturing, whether things are built to last, and what the sort of intention behind them. Is it to maximise profit or is it to maximise utility? And you don't always get the answer that you want from some of those products. I had a very bad experience with a solar panel company a few years ago. I ended up on Watchdog on television because these sods came round to my father-in-law, my elderly father-in-law, who had a 36-year-old boiler and put solar thermal panels on his roof that was collapsing, and they charged him £8,000 for it. It was an absolute disgrace. And, they were basically cowboys who were just, they folded the company as soon, they give lifetime guarantee, but they folded the company. I think solar panels are a really good idea. I think that, that kind of activity, that kind of business activity, which is about profit, it's not about social good, it's not about utility, it needs to be regulated. And maybe we do need more kind of not-for-profit organisations who are resourced to be able to deliver those kind of positive measures that are required, rather than putting it in the hands of the private sector, which doesn't always have that good intention.
On that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up this final panel, but thank you to all of you three. I'm just going to try and sum up for the last 10 minutes or so some of the things that came up throughout the day before we all get to go for drinks. So there was a lot of stuff. It seems like the very last note here was watch out for the green bling and keep an eye out for quality, basically. Sometimes investment in quality does work. But throughout today, some of the ideas that we've seen and heard are see sustainability as an extension of what you do. Think about any responsibility that comes with public funding. Recognize that cultural venues are spaces for experimentation. Treat capital works as an artistic process. Get over the fear of being a non-expert because actually you all have experts in your spaces and in your organizations. Re-examine the relationship that you have with contractors and construction firms and your designers. Get really involved in the design and construction process. Create new partnerships with scientists, policymakers, find your champions in your local authorities, in your organizations, the people who really care and can work with you to create change. Take your time, set your ambitions high, but within that you can work bit by bit, see everything as a process. Start with an audit and maybe a wish list, but recognize that you don't have to do it all or have to do it all at once. Do the thing with the biggest bang for your buck. Get started somewhere. Doing nothing is not an option, so get started where you can. Think about how you might make sustainability more sexy for funders. It can be a bit of a challenge to get them interested in upgrading your boiler or things that are often invisible. Remember that people are very willing to give you advice and expertise. Try to find those that can do so impartially. Have a really clear vision of what you want to achieve. Engage your stakeholders, but also manage people's expectations so that you can take on board the opinions and insights of everyone, but also without letting anyone down too much and without having too many things to follow up on. Remember that the audience's commitment or reaction to sustainability will often come from the commitment to the organization itself and wanting to see them thrive. So if you can tie in sustainability into the thriving of your organization, then that's one way to get your audiences on board and really animate them around what you're doing. Reuse materials where you can and explore them. Explore different materials. Challenge your designers and also have vision, perseverance, energy, and don't take no for an answer. So I think that is a really long laundry list of things to take away from today. So we're about to break for drinks, which will be downstairs. Just before we do that, thank you so much for Arts Council England for continuing to partner with us and allowing us to put on events like this one. Thank you so much for the Mac Birmingham team for hosting us today and also for their great presentations throughout the day. Thanks to Innovate UK for their support. Thanks to Good Energy for their support. And as I said, they are sponsoring the drinks that we're about to have. Thank you to all of the amazing speakers that we've had throughout the day. Thank you so much for everyone who's come along. Thanks to everyone who's watching on the live stream. Thanks to Sweet Take Studio for sorting the live stream and Stage Text for doing the live subtitling. And thanks to James Allen for running around with a camera all day. And thanks so much for the rest of the Julie's Bicycle team as well, without whom obviously this also wouldn't have been possible. If you haven't done so yet, please, please, please fill out a feedback form. They are at the registration desk. It really helps us to make sure that these events remain relevant and that any niggles or anything we can sort of sort out for future ones. Remember that the Fit for the Future guide that a lot of today's event was based around is available for free on the Julie's Bicycle website. Speak to any of us for more information. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again to everyone.